Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the channel for yet another part in our series against the lawless. Against the lawless. Yes, I call it this because I'm sort of in the tradition of the church fathers that wrote like against heresies and against this and against that and all that kind of stuff. It's an why not sort of thing. And it sort of makes you allows people to know from the get-go what you're all about in a sense, right? So I am against the lawless, and this is for me personally a very interesting thing, because I used to be a bit of a criminal, actually more than a bit of a criminal. And we see a lot of this sort of thing these days. And Christians, if Christians did their job correctly, did their job properly, evangelizing the world, preaching the gospel, and called people to observe the requirements of God and to repent from their evil ways, we would see a lot less grief in the world, unlike what we are currently seeing today, where a policeman illegally kill for individuals in a very, very sadistic, very psychopathic way, as in the case of George Floyd. But then even George Floyd is, so this policeman is a lawbreaker, basically. What he did there was murder, right? But then on the other hand as well, George Floyd himself was a lawbreaker, wasn't he? He spent time in prison. He assaulted people. So even George Floyd himself didn't have much concern for the life of other people, for the property of other people, and all that kind of stuff. And so basically, these two meant and evil multiplied, lawlessness multiplied. And now the USA is burning, and more lawlessness has abounded, and innocent people have been caught, have been killed as a result. And it's just crazy, and this is, I believe, a failure on the part of Christians, because a lot of the time Christians are the ones themselves who are trading the gospel and the requirements of Christ and trading it for a social law and a social mindset, a political mindset. And they will believe lies, and they will believe all kinds of nonsense that are proposed, that are supposed to help bring us into the future and bring peace and safety. But we as Christians know very well that, and the Bible has taught us, is that if you do not keep the commandments of God and the faith in Jesus Christ, you are not going to have peace and justice in our time. We're just not going to happen. It's not going to happen if people do not repent, they do not change their ways, if they do not start believing in a higher power to whom they are responsible. It's not going to change. The situation is not going to change, and lawlessness will abound. And the only reason why I never got caught, but that was luck. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I could have gotten caught, I could have been beaten up, and it would have been my fault, because I was a criminal. You know what I'm saying? I was a criminal. I was doing wrong. I was stealing. I was getting into fights. I was abusing people. I would have deserved everything that I got. So I wouldn't have had a recourse to complain. Now that I'm a Christian, I realize this. But obviously, back in the day, I didn't, right? I wanted to get away with it and all these kinds of things. And I heard all of these little arguments as to why I could continue being a criminal and why I shouldn't ever receive my comeuppance. But now, as a Christian, that I've repented and I've realized, the consequences of my actions. Now, as a Christian, I realize that the wages of sin is death. And this is not a. And what is sin? Sin is transgression of the law of God. And so these are not small, insignificant subjects that we are dealing with, and all of that sort of thing. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to continue with our part 2 against the lawless. And so we've done those 3 questions in the first part. We are now going to do the next 3 questions. Right? Was the law nailed to the cross? What about legalism? And what is the purpose of the law? So we can try and establish these things to further understand our position here. So, nailed to the cross. A lot of people say, wasn't the law nailed to a cross? And they get it from Colossians 2 verses 14, saying, blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. And now, ladies and gentlemen, many of you who paid attention to our first part, to our first episode in the series, will realize that I have already quoted other people saying that this handwriting of ordinances was, and this was across the Christian world, when I was quoting this position on other Christians. The consensus of all the Christians across the world was that the handwriting of ordinance, that this verse refers to the ceremonial laws and not the Ten Commandments. Okay, so those of you that are watching this, you need to understand my presentation is hyperlinked. So things that I've said before will tie into things that I'm saying now, and whatever I've said before will then have relevance, a greater significance and greater relevance later on. And so we can already see this come into play, where I showed you quotations, not only the Catholic Church, but John Wesley and all kinds of other people that said that this Colossians over here that many people try to use in order to argue that the Ten Commandments have been done away with, they make it absolutely perfectly clear that this has to do with the ceremonial laws and not the Ten Commandments. So the handwriting of ordinances, this dealt with the feast days, with the days that they would have holidays, how to prepare foods, not how to, for the specific feast days. So not how to prepare food in general, but how to prepare food for, like, for example, for the Passover, you had to have a Passover lamb, and you had to eat the lamb, and what you had to do with the blood, and also you were not allowed to break any of the bones, and all of these kinds of things. And then also how it dealt. So if you read the verse further on, it talks about let no one judge you in terms of new moons and all that kind of stuff. New moon refers to so some of the feast days would be according to the lunar cycle. Right, so it says that don't worry about that anymore. And then it talks about and let no one judge you in terms of Sabbath days. So Sabbath days, there is a plural. It says Sabbath days in terms of let no one judge you in terms of what days you are supposed to have as holidays for the sake of these festivals, these feast days, because these feast days are done away with, and therefore the Sabbath days, or the days of rest, which is what all that Sabbath means. Sabbath is a generic term. It just means rest, day of rest. Means that those days of rest or holidays associated with those feast days are no longer applicable. Therefore, you can feel free to either work or rest as you so require, right? But the Ten Commandments is a completely separate issue on its own and has nothing to do with the ceremonial laws. All right. So to clear this up, there are three basic categories of law recognized in Scripture. You have the first one. You have the civil law. All right, and you need a civil law if you're going to have a nation, as it were. Right? We have civil laws in the UK, in the US, in wherever the case might be, Australia, Russia. You need your civil laws, right? And these were dictated by God at Sinai and written down by Moses. Now, this is very important. It was dictated by God and written by Moses. It wasn't written by God, okay? Written down by Moses in the book of the law and placed beside the Ark of the Covenant. So when Moses had finished writing out this book of the law, he did not place it inside the Ark of the Covenant. That's where the Ten Commandments went. He placed it on the side of next to it. Right, so there's a very, very important little typology there, that the Ten Commandments went inside of the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant represented the throne of God. It was the mercy seat, the throne of God, and the Ten Commandments went inside, and that in that image is to show us that the Ten Commandments are the foundational law upon which the kingdom of God rests, which is why the law of Ten Commandments cannot be changed and will endure forever, because the throne of God and the kingdom of God endures forever. Nevertheless, the book of the law, which Moses wrote, went next to the ark because Moses quite specifically said that this was a witness against them, and this was to be serve as a testimony and a witness against them, which is why it says here, blotting out the handwriting of ordinance that was against us. And this is what we see. It's necessary for any population sizable enough to be considered a formal nation or tribe. provides legislation for national governance in judging civil matters and disputes, and outlines various jurisprudential considerations associated with them. This law expires together with the state, not obliging upon anyone now further than the general equity thereof may require. All right, so there are, so for, let's say, so what does this mean? What does this mean? Okay, so basically when the state expires, right, you no longer have that nation anymore. Okay, and so obviously if the civil law was to govern the state of Israel in those ancient times, in the way that they were formed at the time, you still had the tribes of Israel, you still had a monarchy and all of these kinds of things. That state is no longer around, obviously. So it is not meant for us, right? For us to bring it in to the UK or to the United States, so it would be inappropriate. However, it does say it does not oblige upon anyone now further than the general equity thereof may require. And this is actually, you will actually find this statement in the Westminster Confession. Now, what does this mean? It means, for example, it's like in the certain time, there are certain instances that may warrant bringing these laws over. So, for example, when we say think about murder, for example, murder is still a civil, even though the commandment "thou shalt not kill" is "thou shalt not murder" in ancient Israel carried with it a death penalty and was part of the moral law. In modern day, it's part of the civil law as well, and incurs a penalty. And so the moral law has two applications. It's both a moral law as well as a civil law in modern times. And any Christian nation that would exist, whether Israel or not, right? So whether the America, whether the UK, whether Australia, whatever the case might be, would necessarily make some of the moral laws, some of those laws, into civil laws as well. And that's what it means, further than the general equity thereof may require. So we wouldn't need to make a civil law regarding honoring your mother and father, for example. That is a matter of personal conscience and a matter of personal relationship between the parents and their children, sort of thing. But things like murder, things like theft, would then have to be brought in to a civil situation. Then you have the ceremonial law. Now, again, these were dictated by God at Sinai and written down by Moses. So it was not written by God, it was written by Moses in the book of the law, and again placed beside the Ark of the Covenant. So it was in the same book, right? Governed all aspects concerning the temple, its rites, its yearly feasts, and associated dietary restrictions and preparations. For example, the Passover lamb, as well as the timing of various holidays according to various parameters such as lunar cycles. Spoken of as a type and foreshadow of Jesus Christ himself. For example, the Passover lamb was a symbol of Jesus Christ. This category was temporary, expiring on the arrival of its antitype. And we can see here, those are the relevant Bible verses that are associated with. And then you have the moral law, and it is also called the royal law and the law of liberty and the perfect law, and so on and so forth. Now, this law was spoken by God at Sinai as well before the entire congregation of Israel, and was written by the very hand of God himself, both times on the tablet of stone, and placed inside the Ark of the Covenant. So we've got something completely different here, right? You can see then the verses there. This law exists necessarily from the foundation of the world, for it what? Reflects the character of God, defines what sin is, defines what righteousness is eternal and is unchangeable. Okay, so what do we understand when it says it reflects the character of God? Let's have an example. Let's talk about this, right? If you go to someone's home, father, mother, they've got children and kind of stuff, you will understand the character of the parents by the laws that they have instantiated in the house. So, for example, if the parents have laws and rules in their home that allow the children to eat whatever they want, to fight with each other and beat each other up without any consequences and stuff like that, they're never expected to do their homework. What would you immediately conclude about the parents? You would say that the character of the parents, that the parents are negligent. You would say they were immoral and all of these kinds of things. So the law that you have in place reflects the character of the individual that imposes those laws. And likewise, if the parents, the children, you must brush your teeth, you must do your homework, you must treat each other nicely, you must eat only at the appropriate times, you must eat healthy, all of these kinds of things, respect your parents and all that kind of stuff. You immediately recognize that the parents were then righteous people, that the character was a good character inherent in those people. And so any law that God makes will necessarily reflect his character, because that's just one of the consequences of having a law, right? So this is the situation that we find, right? It reflects God's character. It defines what sin is, because again, where there is no law, there is no sin, right? We're gonna get into that, okay? Defines what righteousness is, and then again, obviously, if it reflects the character of God, and and God is eternal, then obviously the law is eternal, and it's also unchangeable, because God is unchangeable, and if God is unchangeable, his law is unchangeable, because his character is unchangeable. So it's all interwoven and all that kind of stuff. And if you change one, then you mess up the balance, because if you say that the law changes, then you are also saying that God's character changes. All right? And the Bible quite explicitly says that God does not change. God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. All right. So if we look here, Deuteronomy 31, when Moses had finished writing the words of this law in a book to the very end, Moses commanded the Levites who carry the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, saying, take this book of the law and put it by the side of the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there for a witness against you. And what does it say there? That was against us. Handwriting of ordinance was a witness against us. Colossians, witness, that is the parallel. That is the parallel. That it may be there for a witness against you. That's the ceremonial laws, right? On the side of the ark, not inside the ark, by the side of the ark, right? And we can see Colossians, blotting the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. So that's the one. That's the one it's talking about. So Colossians mirrors Deuteronomy 31. That's the parallel. Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of an holy day or of the new moon or of the Sabbath days. Sabbath days there again is plural, right? Is a plural. So there were many Sabbath days, holy days, Sabbath days, rest days, and stuff like that, right? Which are a shadow of things to come, but the body is of Christ. So all of these things were a shadow of things to come. The 10 Commandments were never described this way, as a shadow of things to come. They were a standard of righteousness, right? They were never meant to be a shadow of anything, right? This was a shadow of things to come. It was therefore the ceremonial law which was nailed to the cross, which are described as a shadow of things to come and fulfilled in Christ, a description never applied to the 10 Commandments, right? The 10 Commandments are never ever described as a shadow of things to come. All right? So that's nailed to the cross. What was nailed to the cross? We know that nailed to the cross is a question of, it was the ceremonial laws. The ceremonial laws only. So all of the feast days, your Feast of Trumpets, your Feast of Wheats, your Feast of the Passover feast, and all of the holy days and the rest Sabbath days that were associated with it. So rest days, Sabbath days that were associated with, not the Sabbath day of creation, but the Sabbath days of rest, because those days, right, just because they were a holy day didn't necessarily mean it was a rest day, right? So some days, even though it was a holy day, you would still work and do your own thing, but some of them were a very specific holy day, in which case people would cease their normal activity and for the observance of that feast and all of the rites and rituals that went with it, okay? And so it was, and that was what is taken away. Okay. So concerning legal, when does obedience now become legalism? This is very, very important. And so if we go to Mark, it says here, and he answered and said unto them, Well hath Esaias prophesied of you hypocrites. As it is written, These people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Howbeit in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, right? Laying aside the commandment of God, you hold to the tradition of men, as the washing of pots and cups and many other such like things you do. And he said to them, full well ye reject the commandment of God, that ye may keep your own tradition. Right? That ye may keep your own tradition. Now, this is a problem. Okay? This is a problem. So, legalism is when men, individual men, put aside the commandment, the explicit commandments of God, and start to multiply rules of their own. Right? And start to multiply rules of their own. So here are definitions that I propose for legalism after surveying many articles and things on this. So legalism: the excessive adherence to law or formula with disregard to the spirit of the law, especially at the sacrifice of mercy and love and any other good and proper Christian work or attitude, to the violation of the precepts of love thy neighbor. 2. The pedantic and arbitrary addition or subtraction to any law God has established, so as to oblige duties exceeding or falling short of the requirements God has seen fit explicitly to impose, even to make God's laws a burden contrary to the scriptures. So we see this. All right, let me unpack this. So obedience becomes legalism when I take what God has commanded and I add extra to it. So this is what the Jewish people did. They took the Sabbath commandment of God, for example, you shall rest, and they added so many additions to that, to how to impose. So God, the Sabbath asks something very simple. It says, don't work, neither your manservant nor your maidservant nor whatever. You will do it in remembrance of the creation of God. It's a very, very simple. Cease working, and so on and so forth. Right? Very simple. But the Jews, even today, you can't even tear your toilet paper. Right? You can't even you have to tear your toilet paper. The really, really staunch Orthodox, you have to even tear your toilet paper the day before so that you've got a nice pile so that on the Sabbath you won't even tear the toilet paper, because that's work. Yet they will walk to shul to go worship. They will walk however far or whatever, So it's totally arbitrary. It makes no sense. And the Jews did that. They took the commandments of God and added so much more on top of it, to the point where almost anything you did became sin. Right? And to the point where observing the commandments of God became burdensome. So it took the basic principles and the spirit of the commandments of God and added to them and expanded them to such a massive degree that it actually became absurd. And you find people do that today. People, not because God has explicitly required it, but because in their own minds they imagine that this is righteousness and they will impose their own views on you. Right? And we get this in the Seventh Adventist Church. So we have we observe the Sabbath, and there's the plain and simple way that the Sabbath must be observed, and we rest and we go to church and we do all these kinds of things. But then other people, so for example, let me give you an example, right? There was this gentleman who was looking after an elderly lady who had no one else in the church. Yeah, she had no one else to help her. She couldn't go to the shops and stuff like that. And after church, I was with him in the car after church because he was giving me a lift home. He said, Morgan, do you mind if I stop at the nearest Sainsbury's to buy some groceries for this old lady and stuff like that? And I said, no, it's not a problem. I said, why do I care? He's like, oh, because it's the Sabbath day. And I said, excuse me. I said, the Lord requires mercy, not sacrifice. I said, if this is the only chance you got and you are rendering a service to help this poor lady, who can't move, who can't get out of the house, and this is the only chance you get to go buy her food. Why are you going to let her starve on the Sabbath? I said, the Bible doesn't, I said, the law does not require this. I said, this is, and he's like, but some people would look at me funny. And I said, those people are legalistic. Those people are miserable sons of guns. Those people are Pharisees. Okay? That's the difference. That's the difference, because they did the same thing to Jesus. Jesus would heal and he would help people on the Sabbath. He wouldn't do normal secular work, but he would heal people and stuff that would need it. He would go to the shul, he would go to the temple and worship and do all of those things, but he would also help and heal people and stuff like that. And the Jews tried to accuse him. Oh, what are you doing? Why are you going to Sainsbury's to help that poor person there? Now, obviously, if you can avoid doing secular things, then obviously do it, right? If you have an opportunity to do so, because at the end of the day, it says neither your manservant nor your maidservant should be working. So if you go to Sainsbury's, those people are working for you. But the secular people, they're going to be working regardless and stuff like that. So there's a balance. There's a balance that needs to be achieved, and you need to understand the spirit of God's commandments. Now, legalism is also, here is the commandment of God, and I add extra rules to it in order to try and escape actually observing the commandment. Right? Now, lawyers do this. You have the law and the letter of the law, and the law is very explicit. And lawyers will keep on finding loopholes in order that the person that is guilty of violating the law can get away scot-free. Right? That is legalism. That is when people, but this word over here doesn't really mean that. And you get this, and Christians do this too, right? For example, if you take things like any law. Well, is it theft if I'm hungry? Is it and things? And we try to add caveats and other rules and parameters in order to avoid actually having to obey the law of God. Right? The homosexual community, for example, constantly weaving and ducking and diving to try and avoid the fact that the Bible explicitly condemns homosexuality. Explicitly. Right? But they keep adding extra In fact, they add extra legislation to the point where if you are against homosexuality, it's considered hate speech and a hate crime. It's considered bigotry. So not only is the Bible now been made void, the express will and commandment of God has been made of no effect, but they are in fact going so far as to make that which is evil good and to make that which is good evil. That is legalism. Right? Where it's what lawyers do, where they take a law, right? And this is what you always have. The prosecution is going to find any way to make the charge stick, right? Okay, so that's the Pharisee, right? So that's the prosecution, that you will even add more to the law to the point that you can convict anyone of sin, and you can condemn literally anyone of sin. Everyone is a sinner. If they so much as bat an eyelid in the wrong direction, they're in violation of the law, right? That's the prosecutor, right? And then you have the defense attorney, right? And the defense attorney will do everything that he can in his power in order to make the individual escape the condemnation of the law. Right? It's like this guy clearly murdered someone, but he gets off on a technicality, little rule, on a little weaving and ducking and diving here. And this is what legalism is. And Christians, we are supposed to be obedient, but we are not supposed to be legalistic to the point where we make God's law a burden and end up condemning everyone and everything as sin, even though God never made it sin. And obedience to the law without saying now we get rid of it entirely so that no one is under any condemnation at all. That is legalism. Okay? So obedience is not legalism. Obedience is only legalism when you go too far, either on one way or on the other way, beyond what God has explicitly requested. If he says, honor your mother and father, then that's what you do. If he says, have no other gods, then that's what you do. You don't say, oh well, maybe Jesus is a prophet like all of the other gods, and maybe Islam is the same, maybe Allah is the same as Yahweh. No, right? That's legalism, right? All of these people going out there, and I see this in my church, there are people out there who are saying, oh well, maybe Allah and Yahweh are the same, it's just the Muslims have misunderstood. It's like, no, that's legalism. You are now making void the law of God, which says you will have no other gods before me, and you are trying to make a false god as if it is Christ, as if it is Yahweh, right? That is legalism. That is sin. All right, so that's legalism. Ephesians, for by grace you have been saved through faith, no question. And this is not of your own doing, so works don't save you. It is a gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. But, for we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works. There we go. Which God prepared beforehand, that we should walk in them. That's very, very plain, very, very plain. Old Testament 119. Blessed are the undefiled in the way who walk in the law of the Lord. Blessed are they that keep his testimonies and that seek him with the whole heart. They also do no iniquity, they walk in his ways. Thou hast commanded us to keep thy precepts diligently. Oh, that my ways were directed to keep thy statutes. Man, if we were only as wise as the psalmist. Then shall I not be ashamed when I have respect unto all thy commandments. I will praise thee with uprightness of heart. When I shall have learned thy righteous judgments, I will keep thy statutes. O forsake me not utterly. Therefore, keeping God's commandments is not legalism, but obedience out of love for God as an outworking of faith, and a lack of obedience is therefore a sign of faithlessness. The purpose of legalism is in fact an attempt to either make oneself out as righteous, such as the Pharisees who would utilize them to show off, or it is actually an attempt to escape having to obey God's commandments entirely, that is, to legislate loopholes. James, but someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that there is one God, you do well. Even the demons believe and tremble. But do you want to know, O foolish man, that faith without works is dead? Okay, end of story. John 14, if you love me, a simple statement. If you love me, keep my commandments. If you love God, keep my commandments. And we understand this principle. When you love someone, okay, you understand, like if you're married, like I'm married, my wife has certain laws, right? Like if you violate these laws, divorce, okay? If I love her, you see, it would be wrong. It would not be love. It would be wrong for me to keep those laws, not because I loved her, but because I just wanted to keep her around. That would be wrong, right? That would be wrong. I do them because I love her. It's that simple. And they're not burdensome. They're not burdensome. I do exactly what she requires, no more, no less. But if I start saying, right, maybe if I do this here and do that there and do that there, because I love you. And she's like, well, sweetheart, that's not what I asked for. Right? And then I freak out. Oh, well, but it's the thought that counts. What's my wife going to think of me? She's going to think I'm a moron. She's going to be, sweetheart, I understand that it's the thought and I understand that and stuff like that. But if you love me, you would do what I asked you. You would wash the dishes. You would do what I asked you. You wouldn't do what you think is right. Right? It's like when we buy someone a birthday present. When you buy someone a birthday present, you buy what you know that person will like. You don't buy you don't do what you think they should have, because then you're not considering the other person. It's that simple, right? But then it will also be very wrong, for example, if my wife, and she's got her rules, which says thou shalt not cheat on me with other women, thou shalt not look at other women, you know, like that, all right, sort of thing. But then it would be taking the law to excess. For example, if I said, right, I'm never going to have any female friends ever again, that would be excessive. My wife would be like, no, 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 just don't perv and don't be inappropriate, but obviously you can have female friends. I mean, what are you, crazy or something like that, you know? But I'm like, no, 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 I'm not gonna have female friends. If I will never talk to another woman again in my life, I'm gonna ignore. That would be too far. That would be legalism. So you've got legalism in both ways, right? And that's what you don't want. It's just do what she asked. It's that simple. And don't go up or down or left or right. Just do what she says. It's the same thing with God. All right? Same thing with God. Right. Now, concerning the purpose, what is the purpose of the law? Number one, it defines sin. Romans 7:7. What then shall we say? That law is sin? By no means. The law is not sin. Yet, if it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin. For I would not have known what it is to covet if the Lord had not said, you shall not covet. Romans 4:15. For the law brings wrath. But where there is no law, there is no transgression. Where there is no law, there is no sin. Right? So, for the law brings wrath. So, the only time that wrath can come is if there is a law to be transgressed. Obviously, the law does not bring wrath on its own. The law only brings wrath if it is transgressed. And then it invites wrath. Okay? Which is why it says here that the law is sin. By no means. The law is not sin. All right? And it parallels. So the law is not sin. The law doesn't bring wrath on its own. But where there is no law, there is no transgression. So the law only brings wrath when it is transgressed. Romans 5:13. For sin indeed was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not counted where there is no law. Okay, so yes, the law was given in a solid format, 10 commandments. So Romans, the Apostle Paul is saying, yes, sin indeed was in the world before the law was given. So the law of 10 commandments given on Mount Sinai as a formal thing. So he says, so I actually was sent a video a while ago where the individual, it was a YouTuber of some sort. Now, generally he's okay, but he said that the 10 commandments did not exist before Sinai, which is patently false. Unfortunately, the gentleman, as good and as godly as I believe he is, and generally his videos are very good, he's ignorant, because Paul refutes him here. Sin was indeed in the world before the law was given, and this is a reference to Sinai. But sin is not counted where there is no law. Therefore, if they could sin in the past, Adam and Eve sinned, Cain sinned, right? All his descendants after him sinned, and it was according to that sin that the flood was sent. Therefore, there was a law. It defines righteousness, holiness, perfection, and truth. Romans 3:21-23. But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe, for there is no distinction, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Romans 7:12. So the law is holy, the commandment is holy and righteous and good. By the way, so is God. Remember, we were saying that the rules that a person has in his house will reflect his character, and therefore if the laws are evil, then it's an evil person. If the laws are righteous and holy and good, then you are dealing with a righteous, good, holy individual. Holy commandment is holy and righteous and good. Romans 13:10. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is fulfilling the law. Right? The law is love. Love is the law. Psalm 119:140. Your righteousness is righteousness forever, and your law is true. So if God's righteousness is forever, and your law is true, and truth doesn't change, truth does not change as an eternal, then God's righteous, and the law reveals God's righteousness, so it's intertwined. Therefore, it's unchanging and it's forever. Psalm 19:7. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. It revives the soul. It revives the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. Making wise the simple. Right. So the law is good, man. Proverbs 6:23, for the commandment is a lamp, and the teaching a light, and the reproofs of discipline are the way of life. What can you do, man? What can you do? It's a reflection, or it reflects, or it's a transcript of God's character. In principle, we know that the character of an individual who has authority is expressed not only in the kinds of laws he establishes over those he governs, but also how consistently and even-handedly he applies them. Evil men impose evil and unjust laws, and do so arbitrarily and legalistically, and conversely, righteous men impose righteous laws and just laws consistently with wisdom and mercy. By this principle, we can distinguish between righteous and the evil. Kings, prime ministers, presidents, judge, police, military, parents, spouses, family, so on and so forth. Right? God's character is perfect, good, holy, just, truth, light, love, pure, eternal, righteous, unchangeable, not burdensome. And those are all the Bible verses that you can have referenced there. Pause the video. Right? The law is also perfect, good, holy, just, light, truth, love, pure, eternal, righteous, unchangeable, not burdensome. Those are all the Bible verses that you can find there concerning it. Concerning it. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, we answer the question. Right, let's go back there to the beginning. Right, which law was nailed to the cross? It was the ceremonial law. It was not the law of 10 commandments. What is legalism? Obedience is not legalism, and legalism is when you legislate either beyond or short of the actual explicit requirement that God has. What is the purpose of the law? It is a transcript of the righteousness of the character of God. It defines sin, it defines righteousness, and all of these kinds of things. So ladies and gentlemen, you can see the utility of the law. We can't get rid of it. We can't get rid of it. We have to pay attention to what it is. The law is spoken very, very highly of today. Christians speak of the law as if it is some wretched, horrible, terrible thing that must be discarded. And no, the Bible recognizes no such doctrine. No such doctrine. The ceremonial laws were done away with. The ceremonial laws are done away with, not the 10 commandments. Right? And the Westminster Confession even recognized that even some of the old civil laws, can be transmitted over. Right? But the only one that is done away with, that has absolutely zero applicability today, are the ceremonial laws. That is it. The 10 commandments in their entirety, as they stand, apply today, and you can't get away from it. And you come into serious problems if you're gonna get rid of it. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you all for your viewership. I hope this helps and gets the cogitation going. And take it easy. God bless you, and cheerio.